So for those of you who are just joining us, I mentioned that I strongly encourage you guys introduce yourself in the chat function, and please make sure to participate in the chat function as questions come up. And if you guys just kind of want to interact, there is a great place as well. My name is Brian Banville. I'm the Career Services Manager here at Learn Academy, which is a full-time 4-month immersive boot camp for web development. We specifically specialize in career transitioners, meaning that we teach adults who have never coded before or maybe have just a little bit of experience coding and help them transition into the tech industry, particularly as developers, software engineers, and some other roles in tech as well. One of the additional missions of Learn, which is a little bit past the teaching individuals to be full stack developers, is to help to build and strengthen and diversify the tech community, particularly in San Diego. And one of the ways that we do that are hosting meetups like this one, which is our connected sessions, in order to kind of give back and offer our knowledge to anyone who is interested. As a part of that, at Learn, we do strive to create a very inclusive and brave space. A brave space allows people to express ideas, challenge one another in a positive way, and learn from one another, but never disparage or cause harm. We consider these meetups an extension of our classroom, and we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to keep our meetups a positive experience for all of you. So if on the extremely rare off chance any of the participants in our meetups in our classroom violate our inclusive and brave space for using perhaps insulting or profane language or images, we will remove the person from the meeting and report that person if necessary as part of our code of conduct. But with that, I'm very excited to create this brave space with all of you with one of our alumni. And so I'm really super excited to have Gina here, who graduated in our Bravo 2019 cohort. And today she's going to talk to all of you a little bit about error messages are your friends. And I love your parentheses, Gina, I promise. And so please sit forward, engage, and Gina, with that, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian, for introducing me. I already can't talk. That's a great sign. And thank you guys all for coming to my talk. Brian said I should share with you what I told him before you all got here, which was that I had a stress nightmare about giving this presentation, in which I gave it in person. And at the end, everybody was like, oh, your presentation was too boring, so you can't have pizza. You have to just watch us eat it. So hopefully it goes better than that nightmare. But yeah, please be gentle. So error messages are your friends, and if you don't believe me now, I hope to get you to that place by the end of this talk. So our first step to making error messages our friends is to admit that right now, or when we were beginners, we didn't like them very much. And that's okay to admit. That's a very common thing. Sometimes when we're in boot camps, class situations, or we're working with more advanced people, they've forgotten what it was like before they knew what error messages were all about. And so they'll give you that. That's the first thing you do. Why wouldn't you read your error message? And then you might feel silly. I know I felt silly in the beginning, but so did everybody else. So that's perfectly okay. And we're going to get past some of that fear today. So here are 3 reasons that I, for one, avoided error messages in the beginning, and why I think a lot of people who are new to coding in general avoid them. So first of all, they look pretty crazy until you know what to look for, which don't worry, we're going to get that part covered today. Number 2, they indicate that you have a problem that, since you're just starting out, you may not know how to fix. And then where do you go from there? Then you're just stuck. And third, there's more to learn when you're already overloaded. And I feel like this is particularly true when you're in a boot camp, and especially if you haven't looked at code before starting the boot camp, because you're moving so quickly, you're getting so much information, and there's not typically a period of time that is budgeted for the, you guys can see my screen, right? Yeah, okay. So I should have asked that first, but there's not typically a set period of time that's budgeted for error message specifically going over. You kind of learn it as you go. So you're already focused on something else. You're already trying to learn a particular topic. And now we're trying to just shoehorn in this other topic, and it feels overwhelming. So either in the chat or just by raising your hand, how many of these applied to you when you were new or apply to you right now? Yeah, good. So how are we going to overcome our fear of or reluctance to review error messages? First of all, start with how we view them. So you're probably pretty familiar with it's not a bug, it's a feature, programming memes. Programmers are great at positive spin already. So the first thing to remember is that error messages are opportunities. They already give you some information about your problem. What's even worse is your whole program runs, no errors, doesn't break at all, does not give you the output you expected. Then you have a lot more digging to do to find where your problem is. So start by being grateful when you see an error message, because at least you have some information of where to start. Part 2 is knowing what to look for. So when I submitted this talk to RailsConf, the person who was reviewing the proposals responded and said that he'd asked a new programmer that was working under him to read the error message and look into it. And that individual started Googling line by line, trace back, copy and paste into Google for copy and paste into Google. And the thing is, that's a pretty natural response if you're seeing this wall of text that you've never seen before and you don't know what any of it means and you don't know what you're looking for and you just don't know what to do with it. You start by asking, what does it mean? So I've highlighted here for you the 3 most important parts of any error message. So first of all, the location is here in green. So this is telling you, first of all, the file name, which is errors.rb, and then the line number 5. And that line number, it's important to remember, is where Ruby sees a problem. That's not necessarily where your solution is going to be, but it's where your program sees the issue. And it's a good place to start, even if you do have to look in the surrounding lines for where to actually deploy your solution. Next is the type of error you have, and I'm going to go over some common error types in just a little bit and what to look for specifically with each one. So in this error, we have a name error, which we then know the name of something is a problem. And then you have a description of the error, which is a little bit more information. So in this case, the undefined local variable or method hello. So whatever is named hello, Ruby does not know what that is. And Ruby in particular gives you this did you mean section. And sometimes it's helpful and tells you what you're looking for, and sometimes it doesn't. So don't use that as a crutch, just use it as a hint. And the next thing that you want to do is translate an error message into plain English, or even whatever your primary language is, if that's easier, whatever your brain understands better than twisted up code speak. So if you had to explain this error to your coding partner, think about how you would do that. If you're speaking to another human being with about as much knowledge as you, and given that information, what would be your first troubleshooting steps? So this is where I was gonna poll the audience. So those who have maybe seen error messages before or kind of have an idea of what's going on here, do you wanna maybe put in chat how you would explain this in plain English words? And oh my God, I lost my floating controls. Good, okay. Awesome, okay. I'm gonna put my chat up. So April, awesome. Take a look at line 5 to see the word hello and see if the method is called correctly. Awesome. Getting a name error, I think it has something to do with not, yeah, beautiful guys. So that is absolutely correct. And given that information, you guys have already said, we're gonna look at 9.5, look for where hello is. So now we're gonna look at some common Ruby errors, including that name error. And and we're going to talk about what we're going to do when we see them. So we'll look at name errors, no method errors, which is actually a type of name error, type error, syntax error, and argument error. So with this name error, here is what it looks like without the pretty highlighting. Looks a little messy, a little weird. But now that you know where to look for your information, you can completely disregard everything else for now. Someday you might need to go through your traceback and look at all the individual lines, but in the beginning, don't even worry about it. I'm giving you permission to ignore the biggest chunk of this message and just look at those highlighted pieces. So what any name error means is that Ruby can't find the definition of a method or variable. And what you want to look for when you get this error first is typos. Did you spell it incorrectly? And scope. So maybe you defined a variable in one method and then you're trying to use it in another method and that method can't find it. So I'm going to run my Ruby errors. Okay, so we see we have the error. And you see here, does anyone see in this first function right here where my problem is? Probably has something to do with the fact that I'm not calling the right, yeah, exactly. So if we call hello learn, I have another uncommented. So sometimes, even though I've commented things, it still wants to tell me that there's a problem with them, which is true. There should be, because we're going to look at that later. But you see now that we're getting hello learn from that function. Okay. And another reason you'll get errors upon errors is if you don't save your file between rerunning it and your changes that you made won't take effect. I'm sure we've all run into that at some point in our lives. Okay. So next is the no method error, and this is what it looks like. And we're also going to talk about, so what it means is the method is not defined. As we talked about the name error, Ruby doesn't understand what you've written. And you can see here that Ruby's giving you hints. Are any of these things what you want? So fortunately, it already ran this one for us. And one of these things is what we want in this case. So if we're looking at the code, what we're trying to do here is turn this string version of 5 into the number 5. So maybe we want to perform some math with it later. So we've got the 2, but we haven't finished writing out our method. So once we write our method correctly, now we have our 5. And it will look the same when it's a string or an integer, which is another fun error that we're going to get to deal with very soon. So the next error that we're going to look at is the type error. And this is about what it looks like. So it's going to tell you that you're trying to perform an operation on a type of data that is not the right data type for the operation that you're performing. So usually what's going to happen with this is you have a number that it looks like a number to you because it's what your brain recognizes a number will look like, but in Ruby speak, it's a string. It's just the text version of that number. So one thing that you can do is, especially if you're using variables, is use the variable and then the dot class method, and that will make sure, it'll show you what data type an object is. So that'll help you keep track of, especially if you're converting to different data types throughout your program, it'll help you to keep track of what data type your object is at different moments in time. So here we're going to have a function that, comment this guy out as well. So here we're trying to add 2 and 2, except that one of them is an integer and one of them is a string. And Ruby's not going to like that very much. It tells us very clearly, which is awesome, a string can't be coerced into an integer. But if we change that, now we can do some math. And here it's very clear that you have parentheses around one, not the other. But if you're just using a variable name to tuck your numbers into or your strings, that's where it gets confusing. So that's when we use dot class, like so. Here we have a variable called duck, which contains a string of duck. So now when we run our program, we get the response of string because we're asking Ruby to tell us what type our duck is. Okay, so this is another one I caught earlier that would yell at me the whole time. And that is a syntax error. So this is what it looks like. And it's going to have this weird unexpected T identifier, which is another thing that can throw people off. Don't worry about anything that you don't understand that the error message says when it's a syntax error. Essentially, it will tell you that it's expecting something, which is typically the thing that you left out. So maybe it's expecting a curly brace, maybe it's expecting a bracket, but essentially all it means is that the way that you wrote your code is confusing to Ruby because it's expecting a close or another bracket or quotes a lot of the times. So look for opening and closing brackets, quotes, make sure that your def and your end match up, or what I like to call code Spanglish. For example, I write at work JavaScript and PHP. And you guys probably know that when you concatenate in JavaScript, you use the plus symbol. But when you concatenate in PHP, you use a period. So sometimes when I'm writing PHP, I'll use a plus because I learned in JavaScript. So when you're kind of crossing over your syntax for two different languages, you're going to get code Spanglish and syntax errors. So run our code. We get a syntax error. And it's telling us where it is. It's on line 25. So let's go look at the code. And we're going to look at line 25 specifically. But there's nothing wrong on line 25. So that's the gotcha. That's when you may need to look around for your problem because Ruby gets to this point and can't evaluate this because of a problem a little bit beforehand. So as soon as we fix that, now we can see our vegetables all in a row. And the final error type that we're going to look at today is called an argument error. And this is what it looks like. And essentially, it's going to tell you that your method that you're using requires a certain number of parameters, and you're passing in a different number of parameters from what your program expects. So when you're going in to troubleshoot this guy, you're going to look for where you defined your method and where you called your method, and note how many parameters you passed into each place. And if you're using a built-in Ruby method, check the documentation for how many arguments it expects. Those, at least, especially in PHP, what I'm doing right now, that's where I have the biggest issue I found is using built-in methods that I didn't create because I didn't make them. So I might think I understand what's happening, but when you actually read the documentation, you see, oh, you need to give it, say, an index or something to increment by. And so that's one that I still go astray with 8 or so months down the road into my actual job. So we're all still going to make errors. It's totally fine, totally normal. And what did I do wrong here? Oh yeah, didn't uncomment the call. Okay. So in this case, I am looking for 2 parameters, but I've only passed in 1. And so my program is going to tell me that. And the beautiful thing is Ruby's even going to tell us that we gave it 1 and it expected 2. So now we can go back in and pass it another 1. And now it's perfectly happy to do our math for us. And something that you might be thinking at this point, especially if you're a little further along in your program, is, okay, wow, that's great. You've talked about some common errors and stuff, but they've all been in one file and the code is like 3 or 4 lines. I mean, it's super simple. My program is humongous. My errors are way more complicated. And it's true that your code may be a lot more complicated, but a lot of the time your solutions are going to be exactly this easy. So that's something that should be really encouraging. No matter how big your program is, you still need to remember this closing bracket, and it's still going to give an error this way, and it's still not going to give an error this way. So even if your stack trace is a lot bigger, your solution is probably going to be pretty simple to execute. And that is my presentation. So if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn or on Instagram. And that's what I look like in both places. So if you haven't memorized this face right here, you can find me pretty easily. Make sure you're finding the right person. Thank you guys for hearing me out. And hopefully my presentation was not so boring I don't get pizza. Thank you, all the pizza. I think that might be what I have for lunch then, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina. If anyone has any questions, please feel free. Gina, while we're waiting for any questions to come, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your how you basically discussed your whole process through the boot camp. And because so when Gina was at the boot camp, she actually went through and blogged about it and utilized her social media platforms to do that. So I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about that and how did that help you throughout the program and after the program as well?
Sure. So a shameless plug for my blog, drop that link in the Zoom. You don't have to read it. It's just there if you feel like it. But yeah, so it helped me because I got to really reflect on not only what I was learning, but how I was learning and why I was struggling with things that I was struggling with. And it kind of kept me honest when I was holding myself back or being really especially hard on myself, because I have a tendency to compare myself to other people really hard. Like I still do this on my job with my team. One of my teammates started a week before I did, and one of them, my tech lead, was there 6 months before me, and I compare myself to both of them all the time. And my tech lead has to remind me constantly that we all have different strengths and different things that we struggle with. We all learn things at a different pace. So keeping the blog also helped me keep track of what I felt like I hadn't learned yet and needed to come back to if there was time. And it helped me, I think, feel like I was connecting with other people who were also learning and having those struggles, and my Instagram too, especially. And some people did ask, like, it was funny because I got questions like, oh, do you feel like it gives you an edge to future employers, future jobs, because they see that they can see what you're working on, what you know and don't know and that sort of thing, and that you're engaged with your community. And I always kind of thought of it in the opposite light of like, oh, hey, I'm admitting to potential employers that I don't know what I'm doing and that I had to go in the bathroom and have a good cry and like things like that. But even with that consideration, it felt worth it to me because I wanted to show just my experience, even if it's not other people's experiences. But I still got through it, even with having those occasional bathroom cries, and that it's still possible and normal. And, you know, you can struggle and you can feel like crap sometimes, but you can still do it.
Nice. That's awesome. So one of the chats, Mal, said that this is a lesson like this should be one of the first things to teach new students to prepare them for seeing errors and knowing how to deal with them. Do you think, Gina, that if you had had a better understanding of errors from get-go, that learning code would have been easier? Or do you think that it was something that came like along the way? And what would you recommend for others who are at various points in learning code of how you would tackle error messages?
I definitely think that it would have helped to have kind of a group discussion on error messages, or just here's how to read them moment at some point, even if it wasn't right away, especially because early in the program, maybe in your writing super easy code, you can see your problem right away and fix it without having to read the error message. So you don't necessarily need to read them. I say need, but it's good practice, but you can sometimes correct yourself without having to rely on the clues in the error message when you're first starting out. But I think it would have helped me to at least not like flinch when I see the error message and be like, oh God, that's a lot of text. Like, never mind, I'm not going to look at that. Just go back to the code and look. You know, it would have added another tool to my toolkit rather than just trying to self-correct on my own every time.
Totally. I think what I liked about what you just said, Gina, is the clues that we can find in the error messages and just getting into the practice of reading through those error messages, even if it's visually easy to correct the mistake, but getting into that practice, I think is really beneficial, because a lot of companies, that's almost an expectation of being able to kind of read through the expectations. So in your career at Sochi, how has this benefited you in being able to read error messages as you're going through on your day-to-day work?
Yeah. So first of all, I just see a question that is, did I go to Learn? Yes, I graduated from Learn last year, the end of July, and then my internship, or beginning of July, and then my internship was through August. So I've been out of Learn for, I suck at math, someone else can do that, but since August of 2019.
Almost a year.
And I started my job at Sochi in November of last year. So the question is, how has being able to read error messages like helped me at Sochi? So since we're the tech support bug investigation team, basically it's a huge part of what I do. And a lot of the times what I'm doing is looking in the browser at errors. So you just see, for instance, don't worry, I won't show you anything proprietary, nobody panic. Oh, can't type my own password. And it's not saved because this isn't my work laptop, so if anyone thinks I actually did not ever do my job, no, I do it on occasion. So a lot of the time what I'm doing is going to inspect and looking at either console errors, which hopefully there won't be any on this page, but just looking into the console, if there's a giant red box here, and then kind of expanding it and looking in there, or looking at network calls and seeing what was sent, what we got back. And this was stuff that I'd never even clicked this network tab before I went to Sochi. So if you guys are like, oh my God, we didn't get to that, I'm in my internship, what? Don't worry about it. It's actually super, you'll get it if you need it. You may never even need this. So don't worry. It's like, if I got it, you'll get it. But essentially it's looking at like the response and seeing if there were errors in the response, and then interpreting what that means. We just did a bunch of console errors, and especially because if you've seen console errors, which probably a lot of you have by now, they come up nice and red and terrifying looking, and then they have drop downs and you have to expand the arrows. And so just knowing and just having that mindset of it's clues, it's telling me what's wrong and I'm digging through it for clues, and not it's telling me I'm a horrible developer because something is broken. Being able to go into it with a positive, grateful mindset has gone a long way in helping me be successful at the job.
I have another question for you. Okay. With error messages, have you ever run into an instance where an error message has created a brand new iteration of a product, whether it's through Sochi or those types of things to say, and kind of has led to a different way of solving the problem versus just solving the error as always?
So kind of, I guess I'll use what we were just working on a second ago as an example. So we have a part of the platform that has reviews, and you can click to, so our platform is reputation management. So if you are a business and you have a bunch of different social media, you can manage all of the comments, you can respond to people, you can respond to your reviews, you can pull reports and see kind of the general sentiment, how people feel about you, things like that, all in one place. So if you went to your review section and you click to open the review, it would say, click here to go off and respond to this review, because some review networks don't have an API that you can communicate with. You have to just go directly to them to respond. And then there's a link. And that link was broken. So we were trying to click that link, nothing would happen because it was actually null. And so going through and fixing it with my tech lead, I was like, okay, so I'm thinking we need to get this from the database. We need to, if it's null in the database, then we need to grab the exact review URL. And he was like, wait, it's not that complicated, because the URL actually that it's using here actually just goes to the review page, not that actual review. And I was like, oh, that seems a little bit counterintuitive. And so we could actually put in a feature request to have them use a different URL in that place that's more specific and kind of nicer for the client. Awesome. So yeah, sometimes broken things do lead you to a better product.
Nice. That's awesome. I will say this will be our last call for any additional questions that anyone may have. But Gina, thank you so much for coming out today. And for those of you who have friends who could use this talk, it will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel if you'd like to go back and get a refresher from Gina on why error messages are your friend. So thanks so much, Gina. And it was great to see all of you. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
We also have a meetup happening next Friday about open source, and I'll put the link right here in the chat.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks everybody. You've been a fantastic audience.